All right, so in this last knowledge check, what we're going to do is we're going to add some basically validation procedures and also a try catch exception. So the idea here is I'm going to show a very simple example of how you would implement these. But typically in normal functions, you may not have the validation procedure on the inputs. But it allows me a way to just kind of show you how you could actually implement this type of a procedure. All right, so what I want to do, I'm going to add a step here. I'm going to just make a note in my code base here that what follows is to validate arguments. All right, so I'll validate some arguments, and then I'm going to execute ratio procedure. All right, so to validate arguments, or basically to add in some way of throwing an exception if the function is used in an incorrect manner, we can do that. And I'm going to start by saying, provide an if statement. If not instance. All right, so the idea is if my x argument is not a float or an integer, right, then I want to do something. And in this case, I just want to raise an exception. And this exception is just going to go ahead and say x should be a numeric value. Okay. So now if I execute that, you can see that instance name in. Oh, I need to change this to is instance. We can see this is going to operate as normal, but if I were to go ahead and try to pass, let's say, a string, then I'm going to get an exception thrown that says x should be a numeric value, right? So this is just trying to help out the user when they run into problems, okay? So what I can do now is I can go ahead and I can add the exact same procedure. But what I want to do now is I want to say for y, okay? And again, it's going to work. Maybe if I put in a string here for y, I get, oh, I do need to change my exception verbiage here to y. And now y should be a numeric value, right? So now we're checking to make sure that what the user passes for x and y is in fact a numeric value. Now, this next one says add a try and except procedure where if a type error is thrown for digits because it is a float, then the digits value is rounded to the nearest integer and applied. So what you may not be aware of is this round procedure. It expects a whole number, an integer, right? But if I go with, let's say 3.0, what actually gets thrown is I get this weird error, right? This is a type error. Float object cannot be interpreted as an integer. And this is an error that's being thrown directly by this round. We can see that right here, right? It points to that round. And it's because that is this digit value right here I'm passing is not an integer. Well, that's kind of weird, right? So if somebody passes an integer, or let's say a float that could be interpreted as an integer, it'd be nice if maybe our function just operates as it should without the user doing anything special, right? So let's go ahead. How can we get around this? Well, what I could say is, all right, I want to try to run I'm going to go ahead and condense this down. I'm going to try to go ahead and execute this code. And I can go ahead and add this note right up here. I'm just kind of rearranging a few things here. All right. So I condensed my rounding down into, the actual division and the rounding all into one and get result, right? I want to try to run this. But if I get an error, right? So if it works, fantastic. But if I get an exception, and if my exception is this type error, right, that I actually got earlier, then I want to do something else. Well, what is that something else? Well, what I could say is if is instance, I'm going to check the digits. So if this is a float, what I want to do is I actually want to go ahead and I'm going to say digits equals integer. So this is going to force this to be an integer. And then I'm going to execute this code. Now, if my digits is something else, which could be let's say it's a character string. So I want to add an else statement in here. What I want to do is raise an exception. And this is going to say, digits should be a numeric value. Boom. All right, so now when I run this, and digits is, let's say 3, right? It operates as it should. Let's say this is a float in this way. It still operates as it should. Now, here's one thing to note is like if they were to pass 3.5, right? They're still going to force this to be 3, right? It's just going to round to the floor. We'd have to add some additional rules to get around that. But now if they pass, let's say, something odd like a string, now we're going to go ahead and we get that exception thrown. Digits should be a numeric value, right? So we can do this kind of a procedure where we're going to try to execute some code, but if we get a certain error, then we can modify our approach, execute some other code, and get a different type of result because of that.